He stood beside the throne, dressed in silk, but there was nothing left between his legs. This is not a story of court intrigue, of scheming villains and comic relief. This is the story of a system, a machine that used and discarded men and the horrific price they paid for proximity to power. What does it take to serve an emperor? Loyalty, fear, or the sacrifice of your manhood and your very humanity? If you're back with us at Rotten History, welcome, because in the Forbidden City, the most powerful men were the ones who had already been destroyed. The destruction of a eunuch began not in the halls of the Forbidden City, but in a small, dark room with a single sharp blade. It was a choice, but for most, it was a choice made not by a boy, but by his family. You have to understand the desperation of imperial China. For a peasant family on the brink of starvation, with mud houses and unforgiving land that offered little sustenance, the promise of a son in the palace, a man who could one day send riches home to his village, was a form of salvation. It was a horrifying gamble, a high-stakes lottery where the price of a ticket was your son's manhood. These boys, often as young as 10, were not ambitious schemers. They were children, too young to understand the finality of what was being done to them, their minds filled with vague promises of food and a life without backbreaking labor. But how many of these sons truly understood the fate they were being sold into? The procedure itself was not performed by a trained physician, but by a specialist known as the Blade Master. These men operated in back-alley rooms, their trade a macabre blend of folk medicine and horrifying ritual. The room was simple, a dirt floor with a single pot of herbal water for cleaning, and a small jar for the final, gruesome product. The boy would be held down, his body bound by strong men, his fear a palpable, sickening presence in the small, suffocating space. He was a piece of meat to be butchered, not a patient to be healed. The cutter would work with a practiced efficiency, his knife a small, curved blade honed to a razor's edge, making a single, swift cut. The organs would be removed in a matter of seconds. The sound, a quick, wet slice, was a sound of finality, but the terror of that day would pale in comparison to what was to come. You can imagine the pain, a searing, blinding agony that would send a boy into a state of shock. But the operation was only the beginning. To prevent the urethra from closing, a small bamboo rod or quill would be inserted, a constant, irritating reminder of the violation. The wound would be covered with paper, soaked in oil, and then wrapped in tight bandages to stop the bleeding. The boy would be left to lie in silence, his fate hanging in the balance. The survival rate was far from certain. Many bled to death in the hours that followed, their lives ending not with a royal banquet, but in the filth of a cutter's floor. For those who survived, the next few days were a blur of unimaginable pain, fever, and the constant fear of infection. Their bodies, now broken, would be a source of chronic pain and a host of health issues, including incontinence, for the rest of their lives. But what was the true price of survival, when your body and your soul were already broken? But the final psychological horror of the castration ritual was the fate of the removed organs. Known as the bow, or precious package, they were carefully preserved, first in a jar of oil and then in a box. This precious package was not a morbid curiosity, it was a form of morbid insurance. A eunuch in his afterlife was believed to be incomplete without his manhood. To be a whole man in the next world, to have a complete and peaceful existence, he had to be buried with his package. The Blade Master would keep the package, a terrible form of collateral. If a eunuch wanted to reclaim his package for his death, he had to pay a large fee. This created a profound, lifelong anxiety for the eunuch. He had not only sacrificed his body, but the ultimate fate of his soul was now in the hands of a man who had already profited from his pain. His greatest desire was not power, but to one day be able to purchase his own lost flesh and be whole again. The truth about a eunuch's precious package is even more horrifying than you can imagine. The eunuch's life was a walking testament to this brutality. The physical wounds would heal, but the chronic pain, the urinary incontinence, and the lingering scars were a constant physical reminder of his sacrifice. His voice, once a child's, would never deepen. His body would take on a different, softer shape. He was no longer a whole man. He was an object, a symbol, a half-person, all in the hope of one day finding power in the Forbidden City. But once the wound closed, the real wounds began. The wound on a eunuch's body may have healed, but the real wounds, the ones of shame and degradation, were inflicted daily in the halls of the Forbidden City. This was a world of rigid hierarchy, and a eunuch's place was at the bottom, a visible, breathing testament to his half-person status. Their uniforms were not a mark of distinction, but a brand of their servitude. They wore simple, drab robes of grey or black, their heads were shaved, and their demeanour was expected to be one of perpetual submission. Every movement was monitored, every gesture judged. The eunuch was not permitted to walk with his head held high. His gaze was meant to be fixed on the ground, a constant physical display of his subservience. To look an emperor or an official in the eye was an act of insubordination, a dangerous breach of protocol that could have fatal consequences. Their very voices, high-pitched and strained from the castration, were a constant sonic reminder of their broken state. They were ghosts in the palace, seen and unseen at the same time. You can imagine the constant, low-level humiliation. They were the objects of public mockery, referred to by derogatory names like brooms, pincers, cast-offs, or imperfect ones that cruelly referred to their missing organs and their incomplete status. They were seen as neither men nor women, but something unnatural in between, a perversion of the human form. This perceived abnormality made them a convenient target for blame. When a palace scandal erupted, a missing jewel, a rumour of infidelity, a political misstep, the eunuchs were the easiest scapegoats. Their supposed unnaturalness made them the perfect villains, a class of people with no family to protect them, no children to mourn them, and no legacy to defend. Officials who hated their power would often spread rumours that they used black magic or dark arts to influence the emperor, feeding into the common superstitions about their state. The punishments for minor infractions were brutal and disproportionate. A young eunuch who, in his nervousness, dropped a cup of tea in the emperor's court might be dragged away and beaten with a heavy bamboo rod. The pain a physical reminder of his subservience, the sound of the rod on flesh would echo through the hall, a lesson for all who witnessed it. One account from the Ming dynasty details how eunuchs who were caught speaking when they were not addressed could be sent to a palace guard for a lesson that could end in their death. Another speaks of how eunuchs were starved for days, a punishment meant to break their will and remind them that their very survival was a gift from the emperor. A eunuch's life was not his own. It was a gift, on loan from the emperor, and it could be taken away for a simple, unthinking mistake. The fear was a constant, suffocating presence, a cold hand on your back that never let go. But the most terrifying aspect of a eunuch's life was the silent power play that permeated every aspect of the court. The palace was a web of deceit and political intrigue, and eunuchs were at the centre of it, not as players, but as tools. A young eunuch in the empress's court might be caught in a web of plots beyond his understanding. A wrong glance, a word whispered to the wrong person, a fumbling of a royal fan, any of these could be interpreted as a sign of disloyalty, a signal to be flayed alive. The real power of the court, the power of life and death, was in the hands of the most powerful and feared of the eunuchs, the ones who had mastered this dangerous dance. They were the ones who would use these smaller acts of terror to control the younger ones, to ensure their loyalty and to consolidate their own power. A senior eunuch, with a single contemptuous glance, could condemn a younger eunuch to a lifetime of brutal labour or a quick, silent death. This created a profound, soul-crushing contradiction. They were a class of men who had been dehumanized, stripped of their honour, and yet they were also the most trusted confidants of the emperor. They had no lineage to betray, no family to build a rival dynasty. Their loyalty was, by default, to the emperor alone. This made them indispensable. They were the emperor's eyes and ears, the only ones who could be trusted with the most intimate secrets of the court. They saw everything, heard everything, and their proximity to power made them feared and respected, even by the officials who mocked them. They were the emperor's ghosts, his unseen hands and ears, giving them a level of political access and influence that no court official, with his wife and children to worry about, could ever have. It was a trade of the most grotesque kind, their manhood for power, their dignity for influence, and yet some eunuchs rose too high. And for them, the fall was even worse. The fall was worse because their power, for all its might, was built on an illusion. Their bodies, broken and violated, were a constant reminder of their place, and in the most terrifying moments of a cruel emperor's reign, their mutilated bodies became a source of twisted amusement. The castration, which was supposed to make them sexually neutral and thus safe, in fact, made them objects of a different kind of desire. They were not seen as men, but as living playthings. their humiliation a form of entertainment for an emperor who had grown bored with the rituals of the court. The imperial court, in its infinite hypocrisy, perpetuated the myth that a castrated man was a man of no desire, a safe and loyal servant who could tend to the needs of the inner palace without posing a threat to the imperial bloodline. This was a convenient fiction. The grim reality was that a body stripped of its manhood was not a body of neutrality, but a body uniquely vulnerable to a new kind of cruelty. The emperor, a man of absolute power with no one to question him, often saw the eunuchs not as men, or even as servants, but as a form of human property, a source of amusement to be used and discarded. You can imagine the scene: an emperor, perhaps one of the more cruel and paranoid of the Ming or Qing dynasties, growing tired of the polite formalities of his court. He would turn from his concubines and demand a different kind of spectacle. Some eunuchs, often the youngest and most effeminate, were forced to dress as women. They would be made to wear the delicate silks and painted faces of imperial concubines. Their lanky, often awkward frames a grotesque parody of female beauty. They were made to dance, to sing in their high-pitched, childlike voices, for the amusement of the emperor and his court. The officials would laugh, their faces a mask of forced mirth, and the concubines would pretend to be amused, but the performance was an act of profound psychological violence. The eunuchs, who had given up their manhood for this life, were now being forced to publicly mock what they had lost, their humiliation a form of entertainment for the very man they had sacrificed everything for. But the abuse went deeper than mere spectacle. Their unique position of powerlessness also made them ideal for the most degrading duties. One of the most infamous was the virgin testing of potential concubines. Eunuchs, men who were forever barred from physical intimacy, were forced to perform degrading physical inspections on young girls to determine their purity. They would be brought into a private, hushed chamber where terrified, young girls, often from noble families, would be presented to them. The eunuchs would be forced to undress the girls, to inspect their bodies, to perform acts that were a chilling parody of what they had been denied. It was a ritual that weaponized their lack of manhood, turning them into tools of a sexual hierarchy they could never be a part of. The eunuch, a man without sexuality, was forced to be the silent arbiter of it for others, a perversion of his very existence that left him with a deep, private shame. Some emperors, in their moments of extreme cruelty or boredom, went even further. Historical accounts, often suppressed or sanitized by later chroniclers, describe eunuchs being molested or physically abused for imperial amusement. A young eunuch, serving the emperor in his private chambers, might be subjected to a cruel, non-consensual act, a violation that had no purpose other than to assert the emperor's absolute power. He was a living reminder that the emperor owned not just his loyalty, but his very flesh. To serve in the imperial bedchamber was to enter a world where your body was not your own, where you were a bedguard to the emperor and his concubines, a silent witness to a life you could never have, a reminder of your own lost sexuality. The shame was a private, unspoken horror, a secret that would eat away at a eunuch's soul for the rest of his life. This institutional abuse was a form of control, a way for the emperor to keep the eunuchs in their place. They may have had power, but they were never allowed to forget their origins, their broken bodies, and their fundamental powerlessness in the face of the emperor's will. They were a necessary evil, a tool to be used, a living symbol of a man's absolute dominance over not just a kingdom, but over the very essence of human identity. But the abuse, the beatings, the physical degradation, these were not the things the eunuchs feared the most. They were just the symptoms of a deeper, more insidious disease. But the worst punishment wasn't physical. It was political. The political fall of a powerful eunuch was a horror far more terrifying than any physical cruelty, for it erased not just the man, but his entire existence. To understand this, you must look at the most infamous of them all, Wei Zhongxian. He was a man who, in the late Ming dynasty, rose from the brutal poverty of castration to become a terrifying shadow emperor. He was a man of cunning and ruthlessness, and his power was absolute. He controlled access to the young, naive Emperor Tianqi, a man more interested in carpentry than politics. Wei Zhongxian filtered information, dictated policy, and used his control over the imperial guard to silence anyone who dared to oppose him. He was a puppet master, and the emperor was his favorite toy. The power he wielded was not subtle. It was raw and terrifying. Wei Zhongxian created a secret police force, known as the Eastern Depot, which was made up of his loyal eunuchs. They were an army of shadows, a force that struck terror into the hearts of officials and common people alike. They used torture, blackmail, and political assassinations to enforce his will. The punishments he ordered were legendary in their cruelty. He would order officials to be flogged publicly, beaten with a bamboo rod so mercilessly that their skin would peel off in strips. He would have them banished to remote, disease-ridden lands to die a slow, agonizing death. But the real power lay in his control of the imperial schedule and the emperor's ear. No one could speak with Emperor Tianqi without Wei Zhongxian's approval. Scholars and officials who saw their rightful place being usurped by a castrated peasant grew to despise him. These men, known as the Donglin faction, were the intellectual and moral backbone of the dynasty. They saw Wei Zhongxian not just as a corrupt official, but as a symbol of imperial decay, a walking testament to the spiritual and political rot at the heart of the empire. They dared to speak out, to write memorials condemning his corruption and demanding his removal. For their defiance, they were tortured, imprisoned, or executed. Wei Zhongxian, in his paranoia, saw them as traitors and had their names branded as such. But the fall was as swift and absolute as his rise. When Emperor Tianqi died and his younger brother, the more clever and suspicious Emperor Chongzhen, took the throne, Wei Zhongxian's power evaporated overnight. The new emperor, who had been secretly observing the corruption, immediately began his purge. He stripped Wei Zhongxian of his titles and exiled him to his home province. Wei Zhongxian, understanding that a fall from power was a death sentence, took his own life on the journey. But the horror was not over. The new emperor, in a final act of vengeance, ordered his body to be disinterred, his remains mutilated, and his head publicly displayed as a warning. His name was erased from all official court records, his memory condemned to be nothing more than a symbol of ultimate corruption. The political fall of Wei Zhongxian was not just a punishment. It was a final, systematic erasure of his existence. The emperor, in a single, terrifying act, demonstrated that a eunuch's power was a temporary illusion, and that a eunuch's fall could be a horror far greater than any physical death. And still, for those who remained, the worst fate was yet to come. For those who remained, stripped of their powerful protectors or simply caught in the wrong political crossfire, the worst fate was often a slow, agonizing descent into oblivion, frequently accelerated by the cruelties of the imperial system itself. When a powerful eunuch fell from grace, his loyal followers, regardless of their own innocence, often faced the wrath of the new regime. They were seen as extensions of the disgraced tyrant, their very existence a reminder of the previous corruption. Justice was rarely a consideration. Eradication was the goal. One of the most horrifying fates was execution by slow slicing, or lynching. This was a punishment reserved for the most heinous crimes, and powerful fallen eunuchs were prime targets. Imagine the terror, not a swift beheading, but a process of methodical dismemberment, small pieces of flesh being cut away over hours, the victim kept alive for as long as possible. The goal was not just to kill, but to utterly break the spirit and to make a public spectacle of their demise. The screams, the pleas for a quick end, would be ignored, a final act of dehumanization for men who had once wielded considerable power. Other methods of disposal were equally brutal. Some were buried alive, a silent, suffocating end with no witnesses and no dignity. Others were simply left to starve in the dark corners of the Forbidden City, their bodies slowly wasting away, forgotten by the very system they had served. Public beatings with heavy staves were common, often carried out until the victim succumbed to their injuries or simply died of exhaustion and shock. These beatings were not just about physical pain, they were about public humiliation, a final stripping away of any vestige of the authority the eunuch might have once held. Even in death, there was often no peace. Eunuchs, seen as incomplete beings, were often denied proper burial rites. Some were thrown into mass graves with common criminals, their identities lost forever. Others were simply left unburied, their bodies exposed to the elements, a final act of disrespect. The bow, the preserved organs that were so central to their hope for an afterlife, could be confiscated or destroyed, ensuring not just earthly suffering but also spiritual annihilation in the eyes of their beliefs. Amidst this terror, there were flickers of humanity. Some eunuchs, facing certain torture and death, chose suicide as their final act of defiance, a desperate attempt to control their own end in a world where they had little agency. There are whispers in the historical records of final letters, smuggled out to family members or loyal friends, filled with regret, fear, and sometimes a quiet dignity in the face of unimaginable horror. But these were rare moments, quickly swallowed by the vast machinery of the imperial court. The Forbidden City, with its opulent pavilions and serene gardens, held within its walls a brutal secret: the systematic destruction of those who served too closely, who rose too high, or who simply fell out of favor. Silk robes soaked in blood, the echo of a scream behind palace walls. No one ever heard this was the final disgusting truth of the eunuch's existence. What kind of empire builds itself on broken bodies, then blames them for crumbling? The life of the imperial eunuch is a testament to the moral horror of a system so profoundly corrupted that it used and discarded men as a form of social and political control. They were brought into the palace as children, their bodies mutilated, their dignity stripped away, all for a chance at a life beyond the squalor of poverty. But the price they paid for this promise was a lifetime of humiliation, pain, and the terrifying knowledge that their existence was a temporary, disposable convenience for a monarch. Their power was a mirage, a cruel illusion. They were the emperor's eyes and ears, the masters of the inner court, but their influence was never truly their own. It was a borrowed power, a reflection of the emperor's will, and it could be taken away at a moment's notice. Their silence, the very thing that made them so trusted, was not a virtue of their character, but a necessity enforced by pain and the constant threat of death. They learned to hide their emotions, to suppress their identities, to be nothing more than obedient ghosts in the palace. And for their service, what was their reward? For the eunuchs who found favor, their reward was a slow death. They were given power, but that power was a liability, a target for every jealous official and every ambitious rival. Their loyalty, the one virtue they were meant to embody, became the very thing that condemned them. When a regime fell, the loyal eunuchs were the first to go, a convenient scapegoat for the sins of the emperor. Their reward for a lifetime of devotion was not honor, but a brutal, anonymous end in a mass grave, their bodies and their memory erased. In the Forbidden City, the greatest crime was not betrayal, but survival. For more disturbing truths from history's hidden corners, subscribe to Rotten History.